This is a tutorial on the contingency removal form, CAR form CR. It's a simple one-page form, typically done by the buyer. We'll go through it together. You'll feel capable of doing this yourself once this video is finished. We'll jump right into it here. It starts with a blank line up here. We'll put a number 1. Now, of course, if the buyer was doing a series of contingency removals, for example, they only remove let's say an inspection contingency, and then later want to go back and do another contingency removal for, let's say, the loan or appraisal. When they come back in and make this form for the second time, they'd put a number 2 here, or a number 3 if they have to do a third contingency removal. But typically, people only do 1, so we'll put a 1 right up here. Now, by default, this amends the purchase agreement, so you technically don't have to do anything up here. You don't have to check any boxes. If you want to, you can. So these boxes are for the request for repair, CAR form RR, or the seller's response, CAR form quadruple R, and there's even other checkbox. That's because sometimes when people are negotiating the request for repair, there'll be a condition typically outlined by the seller, and the seller might say something like, I will agree to all the buyer's requests and all the repairs. However, I want the buyer to remove all contingencies simultaneously. And so they'll incorporate this form into the negotiation. And that's when they check those boxes. But even if you forgot to, it's no big deal because, again, by default, it's the RPA and everything ties back into the purchase agreement. You'll put here the date of the purchase agreement, or if you checked one of these boxes, you'll put the date of that form, the property address, the names of the parties, and then we'll move on. So we have boilerplate text here in section 1 that basically informs the seller of the inherent risk of removing contingencies. I should add on that in general, a buyer's earnest money deposit, the EMD, is safe and refundable to the buyer as long as there are contingencies. And contingencies don't automatically expire. So if there's a 17-day contingency period and the buyer doesn't remove contingencies in writing, that period just extends indefinitely. It doesn't just automatically expire. It's up to the seller to give the buyer, to deliver to the buyer a notice to perform that demands the buyer to remove whatever outstanding contingencies there are. And then the seller has to wait 2 days after that notice has been given to the buyer. Now, if the buyer doesn't remove contingencies in those 2 days or perform whatever action was requested by the seller can cancel. But here's the thing, even if the seller cancels due to buyer non-performance, the EMD is still refundable to the buyer. So again, as long as there are contingencies in effect, meaning they haven't been removed in writing on this form that we're looking at, that EMD is safe. Now, there are very rare exceptions to this, and if you have questions, leave a comment, I'll explain. But in general, that's how it works with the EMD. Now we come down to section 2, which is the actual place that contingencies are removed. I like to think of buyer contingencies in 3 parts. You have the loan contingency, the appraisal contingency, and then the investigation contingency. And here you can see it outlined the same way. You have the loan, you have appraisal, okay, it's pretty simple. But then you have investigation C, and there's like this mess of text here. The reason is that when we had the RPA changed back in last December, they parsed out the investigations. You'll see that we have loan, appraisal, okay, and then we have investigation, and then all these different components of it. Investigation, informational access, review of seller documents, review of the preliminary title report, HOA docs, even solar. So it's all parsed out. They do the same thing here. So in theory, a buyer's agent could check a box and only remove a partial component of the investigation contingency rather than all of it. So a good listing agent should know that basically these are very likely going to be all expiring the same time. See how we have 17 days here? That these are all expiring the same time, and they're going to tell the buyer to remove all of it down here. I'll get to those in a second. But that's what you want to look out for. You have basically 3 components with investigations being parsed out into all these different pieces. Now, sometimes if HOA docs are running late or something, a listing agent might tell the buyer's agent, hey, look, I know that HOA docs are running late, so can you remove everything, but you can leave HOA docs or something like that. And so that's the convenience of having these parsed out. You can specify an individual disclosure that the buyer may need more time with. Now, down here, it's a little easier because you can say, hey, remove all contingencies except, and this allows the buyer's agent, again, in that same scenario I was talking about, like let's say HOA docs are running behind, the buyer's agent could check this box and then also check this box here and say, hey, I'm removing all contingencies subject to, or with the exception of HOA docs because we haven't gotten them and I don't know what's on there. And I don't want there to be something outrageous that none of us knew about. But typically, you won't even need to do that. These are special cases I'm talking about. You'll just check this box here on line 4. Buyer hereby removes any and all buyer contingencies. And that's it. Now, when the buyer checks this and signs, that's it. There's no going back. That EMD becomes non-refundable. The deposit becomes non-refundable. And we come down here. Buyer's going to sign. That's it. Now, I see this mistake made on a fairly regular basis. A buyer's agent will have the buyer fill this out and then sign it and then send it to the listing agent. And then the listing agent or the listing agent's TC has the seller sign down here. Well, this form does not require a counter signature from the other party. All it requires is the party removing contingencies to sign. That's it. It's a declaration. Hey, I hereby remove contingencies. You don't need someone else to acknowledge it. That's it. The reason there's a seller signature is because in rare cases, there are seller contingencies. And what are they? Well, there's examples right here. Sometimes the seller needs to find that replacement property or close on the replacement property or who knows what else. There's an other box. But in rare cases, there are seller contingencies. Now, in that case, nothing needs to be done up here. If the seller's doing a seller contingency removal, let's say the RPA was subject to the seller finding a replacement property, and that replacement property has been found, well, the seller's going to check this box, sign here, deliver it to the buyer, and that's it. All that does is remove the contingency out of the RPA, but the buyer doesn't need to sign anything. So, rule of thumb. The party that's removing the contingency signs, and that's it. They deliver it to the other party, and the other party doesn't need to sign anything. And then we're done. That's it. A one-page simple form for contingency removal, making the earnest money deposit non-refundable when the buyer does it. When the buyer does it and delivers it to the seller. I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. Thank you.